The promotion meeting lasted under 10 minutes, the decision already made. My work was praised, my results recognized, and then came the line, "You're reliable, but not senior leadership material." It wasn't whispered privately, it was documented, circulated, and quietly shared. Years of carrying systems, clients, and crises were reduced to a polite rejection I was expected to accept graciously. That was the moment everything shifted. Not anger or revenge, but silence, precision, and consequences no one had anticipated. The conference room door clicked shut behind me, and Marka didn't glance up from the folder in front of her when she said, "Let's keep this efficient." 30 seconds later, she slid a printed document across the table, adding, "We've reviewed your promotion request and decided not to move forward." I didn't touch the paper. "Can you clarify what's missing?" I asked. Finally meeting my eyes, she replied, "Leadership presence. You execute well, but this role requires someone more visible." Two other managers sat silently, pretending not to listen. "This is the senior operations role I've been acting in for 18 months, I said. Marcia nodded once. "Acting?" "Yes." "Officially?" "No." She tapped the document. "Your performance is solid, dependable, but this isn't the right time." Then she crossed the line. "We'll be assigning the role to someone who can represent the department externally. You'll continue supporting from your current position." Supporting. The humiliation became formal. It wasn't an opinion, but a written, approved decision, already set to be announced. I saw the distribution list: senior leadership, HR, finance. "So this was never a discussion?" I asked. "No, this meeting is a courtesy," she said. That was the betrayal, not the denial. I closed the folder. Understood. One manager shifted. Marcia relaxed, assuming it was over. "Good," she said. "We'll need you to stay focused. The Hellbrook rollout is behind schedule, and I expect you to make up the gap." I stood. "I'll follow my role description," I replied. She frowned. "What does that mean?" "I'll do exactly what my job requires," I said, leaving the room. That walk back marked the first time the line had been crossed publicly and cleanly, ending the power dynamic they relied on. I didn't send the usual recap email or soften the announcement. I forwarded it as is. By noon, messages arrived. "Are you okay? Is this temporary? What does this mean for the rollout?" I replied to none. At 1:15, Marka appeared beside my desk, quietly saying, "We need to talk about priorities." I looked up. "My priorities are listed in my job description." Her voice tightened. "That project is critical," I said. "Then it should be owned by the person assigned to lead it." That was the second moment. The shift was subtle, not dramatic, not loud, but irreversible. She stared at me for a long moment, then said, "We'll discuss this later," and walked away. The rest of the afternoon unfolded unlike any other day before it. Meetings started late. Questions went unanswered longer than usual. Decisions stalled where I would have quietly stepped in before. At around 5 p.m., I shut down my computer and stood up. Marcia was on a call in her glass office, gesturing sharply, already agitated. I didn't look back. That evening, the announcement went out company-wide, a congratulatory note for my replacement, praising leadership, vision, and future growth. My name appeared only once in a line, thanking me for ongoing support. By the next morning, the consequences had begun, and for the first time, they were happening without me absorbing the damage. The morning started as it always had, except for one deliberate change. I arrived exactly when my badge required me to, not a minute earlier. The building was already buzzing, monitors glowing, conversations mid-sentence, and I took my seat without acknowledging the familiar looks that usually signaled expectation. My inbox filled quickly, but I answered only what was addressed to me directly and left the rest untouched. When a calendar reminder popped up for a meeting I had always organized, I declined it with a single line. Please confirm the meeting owner. A few minutes later, someone from planning leaned over my cubicle wall and asked, "Are you joining us?" I replied, "I wasn't listed as an attendee," and turned back to my screen. That was it. No explanation, no justification. The first ripple appeared before lunch. A report that normally landed on an executive desk by mid-morning hadn't been formatted, summarized, or softened. It went out raw, exactly as generated. And the reply all chain that followed told me everything I needed to know. Questions stacked up. Clarifications were requested. No one quite knew who should answer them. In the past, I would have stepped in quietly and closed the loop before it became visible. I didn't. At one point, a manager stopped by and said, "This usually doesn't get this messy." I answered, "The process is documented," and watched him walk away unsatisfied. The shift wasn't loud, but it was noticeable. People were used to results appearing without seeing the work that produced them, and now they were seeing the gaps where I used to stand. Late in the afternoon, Marcia sent a short message asking for a quick sync. I replied that my availability was already booked and suggested a later time. There was no argument, just a long pause before a calendar invite arrived for the following day. I accepted it without comment. By day's end, small delays had turned into visible friction. A decision sat unapproved because no one wanted to sign it. A client email lingered unanswered while 3 people debated ownership. None of it was catastrophic yet, but the rhythm was off, and everyone felt it. When I shut down my computer and stood to leave, a colleague asked, "Are you working from home tonight?" I said, "No," and walked out. That evening, my phone buzzed more than usual, but I didn't pick it up. The next morning, the tone had shifted. Conversation stopped when I approached. A meeting started late because the agenda hadn't been finalized. Someone asked aloud, "Did we miss something?" And no one answered. The system they relied on wasn't broken. It was simply being used as written. By mid-morning, Marcia's name appeared repeatedly in internal threads, tagged with urgency. I watched the escalation from my desk, not intervening, not correcting, not absorbing. This wasn't defiance. It was compliance. And for the first time, the difference between those two things was visible to everyone else. By the third day, confusion had hardened into something sharper. It wasn't panic yet, but it was close. Meetings were being scheduled and rescheduled because no one could align on next steps. A vendor call ended abruptly when it became clear the presenter didn't have the authority to approve the changes under discussion. I was copied on the follow-up email and watched the thread stretch longer with every reply, each one circling the same unanswered question. Mid-morning, Lucas stopped at my desk and said quietly, "They're asking where the revised timeline is." I looked up and asked, "Who's leading that?" He hesitated. "I thought you were." I shook my head. That assignment had moved with the promotion decision. He blinked, processing it in real time, then said, "Right," and walked away without another word. The exposure came in pieces, not all at once. A status update went to leadership, missing 3 dependencies that had always been caught before. A client asked for clarification that no one could provide on the call, and the silence stretched long enough to be uncomfortable. Someone finally said, "We'll circle back." The client replied, "You already said that yesterday." That line traveled fast. Around noon, Marka called an impromptu huddle with the project leads. I wasn't invited. 10 minutes later, my phone lit up with a message from one of them. "Can you explain how the approval flow is supposed to work?" I replied with a link to the shared documentation and nothing else. 5 minutes later, Marka appeared beside my desk again. "This is spiraling," she said, voice low. "People are blocked," I answered. The structure was changed. Her jaw tightened. "You know how this works." I met her eyes and said, "I know how it used to work." That was the moment her certainty cracked. She wasn't angry yet. She was unsettled. The rest of the afternoon unfolded in a series of small failures that would have been invisible before. A presentation went to the executive team without context. A decision was delayed because no one wanted to own the risk. At one point, someone said aloud in a meeting room I was passing, "Why does everything feel harder this week?" No one responded. By late afternoon, Marcia sent a message asking me to join a call that had already started. I declined and replied, "Please include me as an owner if participation is required." The call ended 8 minutes later. At 4:30, an email went out from finance flagging a missed internal deadline. It wasn't critical yet, but the language was formal and the distribution list wide. That was new. When I stood to leave, Lucas looked up and said, "They didn't realize how much you were handling." I said, "Neither did I," and walked out. The following morning, the tone had shifted again. Confusion was no longer contained within the department. Questions came from outside it. A senior leader asked in a meeting why a routine decision required escalation. No one answered directly. Later, I was asked to quickly confirm a detail for a client email. I replied that I wasn't listed as responsible and suggested the assigned lead review the documentation. The email went out without confirmation and returned with more questions. By lunchtime, Marcia's name appeared in subject lines she didn't control. She stopped by once more. "We need to stabilize this." I replied, "Stability requires clear ownership." She exhaled slowly. "We'll talk." I nodded, already turning back to my screen. The system hadn't collapsed yet, but it was no longer holding itself together, and everyone could see exactly where the strain showed. The break came on a Thursday morning, the kind that doesn't announce itself with alarms, but with silence where answers should be. A standing client call started without a clear lead, and within 5 minutes, it was obvious no one on the line understood why the revised plan conflicted with the signed timeline. I listened without speaking, hearing familiar assumptions unravel one by one. Someone said, "That shouldn't be an issue." The client responded, "Then why is it now?" The pause that followed was long enough to be noticed. I was copied on the summary request afterward, not as an owner, but as a reference, as if proximity alone might fix what authority no longer covered. I didn't respond. By mid-morning, the issue had multiplied. What began as a scheduling conflict exposed deeper problems, approvals that depended on sequencing no one had mapped correctly, a vendor escalating concerns citing conflicting instructions from two managers, and finance flagging a cost variance tied to rework. None of these were new risks. They had always existed. The difference was, no one was intercepting them anymore. Around 11, Marcia convened an emergency meeting and included me. This time the tone was clipped, strained. "We need clarity," she said, looking around the room. "Now," a director demanded. "Who actually owns final sign-off?" Another said, "That's how we've always done it." I waited until someone finally turned to me. "Can you explain how this was managed before?" I replied, "It was managed through informal coordination." The room went quiet. Marcia asked, "What does that mean?" I said, "It means the process worked because someone was absorbing the gaps." No one challenged that. The meeting ended without resolution. 30 minutes later, an email went out to senior leadership acknowledging a delay, a word never used publicly for this account before. That was when the phone started ringing. The client requested a call with leadership. Not later, not tomorrow, immediately. I was added to the invite without explanation. When the call began, the client was direct. "We're seeing inconsistencies that suggest a lack of internal alignment. We need to know who is accountable." Marcia answered with generalities. I stayed silent. After a moment, the client said, "Josephine, you've addressed these issues in the past. Can you confirm whether this plan is viable?" I replied, The plan can work if ownership is clarified and authority is aligned with responsibility. Marcia looked at me sharply. The client pressed. So, it isn't aligned now? I said. Not as currently structured. The call ended shortly after, and within minutes, messages began stacking up. Executive assistants asking for summaries, directors requesting updates, someone from compliance questioning why documentation didn't match execution. None of it was hostile yet, but the pressure was unmistakable. Early in the afternoon, Marcia stopped by my desk. "We need you to take this back." I answered. "I can't take responsibility without authority." She said, "This is about teamwork." I said, "This is about accountability." That was the first time she had no immediate response. Later, a calendar invite appeared for a meeting labeled Stabilization with attendees I had never met before. When it started, the questions were sharper. Why are decisions bottlenecked? Who approved this change? Why is the client escalating? Each question landed without a clear owner. At one point, someone said, "We assumed Josephine was handling it," and another replied, "She's not in that role anymore." The words hung heavy and undeniable. By the end of the meeting, no plan had been agreed upon, but one thing was clear: the issue was now visible at a level where it couldn't be quietly corrected. At 4:45, Marcia called me into her office, closed the door, and said, "This is bigger than I expected." I replied, "It always was." She looked tired, not angry, and asked, "What do you suggest?" I said, "Decide who owns the outcome." She nodded slowly. When I left the building that evening, the lobby screens cycled internal alerts about revised timelines. The system hadn't collapsed, but it was exposed, and for the first time, the cost of pretending otherwise was being counted by people who couldn't ignore it. The next meeting was scheduled for early afternoon, labeled simply Alignment, which told me everything I needed to know. When I walked in, the chairs were filled, and the tone had shifted from irritation to calculation. Marcia sat at the head of the table, hands folded, eyes fixed on the screen displaying unresolved items. She didn't open with context or explanation. "We need to reset expectations," she said. Someone across from her replied, "We need to stop the bleeding." That was the first honest sentence I'd heard all week. The conversation moved quickly, skipping over what had happened and landing directly on consequences. A client had paused approvals. Finance had flagged exposure. Leadership wanted reassurance. After 20 minutes of circular discussion, Marcia turned to me. "What would it take to stabilize this?" The room went quiet. Finally, the question they had been avoiding was asked out loud. I answered evenly. Clear authority, tied to accountability. She pressed. "Meaning?" I said. "The person responsible for outcomes must also control decisions." Someone else added, "We don't have time for restructuring." I replied, "Then you don't have time for stability." That landed. Marca leaned back and asked, "If we put you back in charge, can this be fixed?" I didn't answer immediately. I said, "Define back in charge." She glanced at the others, then said, "Ownership of the rollout, direct access to decision-makers, final sign-off authority." I nodded once in acknowledgement. A pause followed. Then someone said, "We can do that." I replied, "Then it should come with the role that was denied." The word denied hung in the air, uncomfortable, but accurate. Marcia's expression tightened. "We're not revisiting that decision right now," I said. "Then we're not revisiting stability." The room shifted again. Not confusion or frustration this time, but recognition. They were seeing the cost of their earlier choice in real time. Marcia cleared her throat. "What are you asking for?" I said, "Formal authority over operations. For this account and any dependencies tied to it, direct reporting on outcomes, no informal expectations." She asked, "And compensation?" I answered, Aligned with responsibility. There was no argument. Someone took notes. Another asked how quickly changes could be implemented. I said, immediately, once authority is clear. The meeting ended with promises and follow-ups, but nothing signed. As I stood, Marcus said, "Stay close this afternoon." I replied, "I'll be available within my role." That afternoon, emails arrived with draft language, revised scopes, proposed titles, each one edging closer to what they needed but stopping short of commitment. At 3:30, Marka called me into her office again. She closed the door. "We underestimated how exposed we were," I said. "You underestimated how much was being held together quietly." She nodded, then asked, "Is this about making a point?" I said, "It's about correcting a structure that doesn't work." She studied me and said, "If we do this, things change." I said, "They already have." When I returned to my desk, a calendar invite appeared for the next morning, this time with senior leadership included. The subject line read, "Decision." That evening, I left at my usual time. Messages continued, but the tone was different. Less assumption, more caution. They weren't asking me to fix things anymore. They were asking whether I would. The next morning, the meeting started on time, which alone showed how seriously it was being taken. Senior leadership filled the room, people who normally appeared only after outcomes were guaranteed. No time was wasted on summaries. One said, "We need a decision today." I nodded. "So do I." Marcia didn't speak at first, watching to see how the room would handle it. The opening offer came quickly. Temporary authority, short-term control, a promise to revisit titles later. I listened, then said, "That doesn't solve the problem." Someone asked, "What problem specifically?" I replied, "The gap between responsibility and power." The room went quiet. I continued, "I'm being asked to stabilize outcomes without structural authority. That's the same arrangement that failed last week." A senior leader leaned forward. "What are you proposing?" I laid it out plainly. Formal ownership of operations tied to this account and its dependencies, direct access to executive decision-makers, clear sign-off authority documented and communicated company-wide, compensation aligned with scope, no back-channel expectations, no implied coverage beyond role. They looked at each other, calculating timelines and trade-offs. Finally, someone asked, "If we agree to this, how quickly can you turn it around?" I said, "As soon as it's official." Marcia spoke carefully. "And if we don't?" I met her gaze. "Then the system will continue behaving exactly as it is." Another leader asked, "Are you prepared to walk away if this doesn't happen?" I said, "I'm prepared to continue doing my job as defined." That answer landed harder than any ultimatum could. The conversation shifted. Titles were discussed openly. Reporting lines adjusted in real time. Someone drafted language on a shared screen while the rest of us watched. When the final version was read aloud, it was clear, specific, enforceable. I said, "That works." One executive asked, "Is there anything else?" I paused, then said, "One condition. This structure needs to be communicated clearly. No ambiguity, no assumption I'll fill gaps quietly." There were nods around the table. Marcia exhaled slowly. The decision was made. I didn't celebrate. The shift was already visible in how people spoke to me. Direct, precise, accountable. Back at my desk, the announcement email was drafted, pending final approval. I reviewed it, suggested one change to clarify authority, and sent it back. Within the hour, it was live. The effect was immediate. Questions came to me that should come to me. Decisions moved without friction. The client call that afternoon was different. Clear answers, no hedging, no confusion about ownership. When it ended, the client said, "This is the clarity we were looking for." I closed my laptop and stood up. The work wasn't finished, but the terms were set. For the first time since that meeting weeks earlier, I wasn't carrying anything that didn't belong to me. The weeks that followed were quieter, but not calmer. The difference was that the noise now had a direction. Decisions were made once instead of 3 times. Questions landed where they belonged. When something stalled, it was visible immediately, not absorbed and hidden. The client resumed approvals within days, not because anything miraculous happened, but because the structure finally matched the responsibility. On the first review call after the change, one of their directors said, "This feels different." I replied, "It is." Internally, the shift was just as measurable. Escalations dropped, email chains shortened. Meetings ended with clear owners instead of vague next steps. People adjusted quickly once ambiguity was removed. A few struggled at first, not because the work was harder, but because they could no longer rely on someone else to quietly catch what they missed. Marcia kept her distance during that period. When we did speak, it was focused and professional. She no longer framed requests as assumptions. She asked directly and waited for an answer. That alone told me everything had changed. One afternoon, a senior leader stopped by my desk. "We didn't realize how much risk we were carrying." I answered, "Risk doesn't disappear just because it's managed quietly." He nodded and moved on. That acknowledgement didn't come with an apology, and it didn't need to. The structure spoke for itself. A month later, performance metrics were reviewed at the executive level. Delivery timelines stabilized. Cost variance dropped. Client satisfaction scores ticked upward. None of it was dramatic, but all of it was undeniable. During that meeting, someone remarked that the department felt more mature. I didn't respond. Maturity looks boring when it's done right. Outside the office, my days changed too. I left on time more often than not. I stopped checking messages late at night. When I was home, I was actually home. The work still mattered, but it no longer consumed space it didn't earn. That balance wasn't a perk of the new structure. It was proof that it worked. About 6 weeks in, Marka asked for a brief meeting. She closed the door and said, "I need to say something." I waited. "I didn't block the promotion because I thought you couldn't do the job," she said. "I blocked it because I couldn't afford to lose what you were doing." I answered evenly. That's the difference between managing work and managing people. She nodded once. There was nothing more to add. The company didn't collapse, and it didn't transform overnight. What changed was subtler and more permanent. The habit of relying on invisible labor was broken. The expectation that someone would quietly fix what wasn't theirs to own no longer held. New hires were given clearer scopes. Decisions were documented properly. Ownership was assigned early instead of retroactively. A few months later, during a quarterly review, the same executive who had once circulated my rejection asked me how I would handle expansion if demand increased. I outlined a plan, not quickly, not defensively, but deliberately. He listened without interrupting and said, "That makes sense." That was it. No praise, no performance language, just recognition embedded in action. Looking back, the moment that mattered most wasn't the meeting where terms were set or the announcement that followed. It was the moment the system stopped depending on silence to function. The humiliation that started it had been public and formal. The correction was just as visible, not through anger or spectacle, but through consequences that couldn't be ignored. The work didn't change. The conditions did. And once they did, everything else followed. I didn't win by shouting or threatening. I won by noticing what I had already built and letting it stand on its own. For years, my power was quiet, files named clearly, decisions logged, timelines reconciled, risks tracked before they surfaced. None of it looked impressive in meetings. All of it mattered when the noise started. The hardest part wasn't the humiliation. It was realizing how much of myself I'd given away by making things easy for people who never learned how they worked. I had trained them to depend on my silence. When I stopped filling the gaps spoke loudly. What surprised me most was how prepared I actually was. I didn't scramble. I didn't improvise. I followed the record. Every answer existed already because I had taken the time to write it down when no one was watching. That patience became leverage, not as a weapon, but as proof. If I could talk to a friend living through something similar, I'd say this: start treating your work like it will be questioned someday. Keep notes, save decisions, confirm scope in writing, not because you're defensive, but because clarity protects you when respect doesn't. I also learned that quiet strength doesn't announce itself. It accumulates. It waits. And when it's finally needed, it doesn't beg for permission. It simply shows up complete and undeniable. The story people saw was about a role and a correction. The truth was simpler. Preparation outlasted arrogance, structure outlasted ego, and the calm choice to document my work changed the balance of power without raising my voice. That lesson stayed with me, reminding me that careful habits repeated daily can turn ordinary work into a shield when titles, promises, and praise suddenly disappear from the room and the email trail behind. How to get started today? Write decisions down the day they happen. Save emails that define scope or responsibility. Keep simple timelines for recurring work. Name files so someone else could follow them. Review your notes weekly for gaps. Have you ever realized your quiet preparation mattered only after things broke?